Oh my gosh. Okay. I think we're live. Dylan, I'm so glad we are here. We've been wanting to do this for a little while. We are going to, I don't know what we should call this, a history of the EU fandom, maybe our history in the EU fandom.
Hmm.
Basically, really in some sense, pre 2014 and post 2014, and hopefully beyond, right? And maybe some point down the road, another 8 years from now or something, we'll come back and sort of see like what the previous 8 years held. Hopefully, some of the same highs, hopefully more highs than lows, hopefully fewer of some of the lows we've had, right? But what I thought it would be really fun to do, particularly because you, Dylan, have really been around since the beginning. And although I have a sort of a pre 2014 history that relates to sort of the EU fandom in some sense, anticipating the discontinuation, you've really been around in a big way, very concertedly involved with groups like Twin Suns, with early, Facebook groups, social media campaigns and stuff. You have so much to provide. So I want to kind of pick your brain. I want you to sort of help anyone who watches this sort of understand just like the amazing amount of things that have been accomplished that you've been involved with. Also to talk again about some of the highs, some of the lows, everything in between. So super excited. We want to do this for a long time. Thank you. Thank you for being available
So
to do it.
you
So
give
yeah.
me you give me way too much credit. I was not here at the beginning. This sounds like such like a minute point, but I did not know about the discontinuation until August of 2014. So that's
Oh,
when
fascinating.
I started, like that's when I like actually officially started joining, getting involved in the community. So I missed the first like roughly the first 4 months of the movement's history, and
Wow.
I don't really know, aside from secondhand conversations of some other people um, who were around at the time, of what was going on. But from there, I kind of I just slowly started, as I got more and more involved. I've slowly just started getting put in charge of things because I was the only one willing to do things. And
Hmm.
then that led to, and then because I was in charge of one thing, they'd say, "Oh, can you do this too?" And then it just kept going until I had so many things that some of the things I was working on just had to get put to the wayside. And then every now
Right.
and then, I'll talk about this later. Every now and then, someone will have an idea that's like, "Oh yeah, we used to do that. In fact, I used to head that, but I got way
Yeah.
too busy with these other things. But if you want to do it, here's all the resources, here's what we did, and all this." And
Yeah.
then it never happens. And I'm just like, ugh.
It's tough. It's tough. Like, I mean, yeah, it's important to be a doer, and doers attract more work, right? Which is the problem. So you end up having to do a lot. But yeah, hopefully, and that's really actually in some sense too. One objective of this is that, hey, maybe some people hear about some things that maybe they thought about or hadn't thought about, but are inspired to do, and maybe you're doers too, right? And so yeah. But I've heard you say this before, which is like, hey, like if you think this, and by the way, even things that you are getting accomplished, like if you liked the billboard and you want to see another one, there can be two billboards at the same time. Go get one started too, right? You know what I mean? So lots of these things can all happen at once. And
Yeah,
I think
none of
more
the.
important,
Go ahead.
go ahead. No,
Oh,
I just want to say this is something too that I mean, when we talk about like a movement inside of fandom, let a thousand flowers bloom. Like the cool thing is we don't have to like whatever you do, I don't necessarily have to agree with. We can all do lots of different things too, right? And they can all work in parallel. We don't know which one's going to work, so try everything, right? So in case we get any viewers, I think the comments is going, so we probably won't respond to all the comments here. But by all means, as folks are watching this, please drop some things into the chat. So Dylan and I have been working on a spreadsheet on the side. We're not going to show this. It's just sort of a work in progress. Who knows? Maybe someday we'll build the ultimate timeline for a website or something like
I don't
that.
remember. There's some things where I'm just like, I remember a name and I remember a thing, but I'm like, oh, I remember this, and I remember it was a controversy, but I don't
Yes.
remember why. What was the drama there? I just.
Yeah. Oh yeah, right. And then there's other things like I couldn't believe it. I put this together and we sort of broke it down by years and things, right? And I couldn't believe it. Put it together and I think I forgot to put like Heart of the Jedi on there. I mean, it's
Mhm.
amazing big things you forgot, right? And there's still so much here that I really think about it. But and one thing we want to be clear about too is like we're not going to be like strolling through just like gossip and stuff like that and calling
No.
people out in groups and stuff like that. More uh really I want to flip that. I really want to actually highlight some of the really cool things that have happened too, but at the
Mhm.
same time where there have been lows, I think to sort of like provide some I don't know, just historical context, right? In the event that
Yeah.
it's like of interest to anyone, right? And more than anything, look, it's like I said at the beginning, like in some sense this is like our history of the fandom, right? We have a
Right.
very sort of like interconnected, overlapping sort of like history within the EU fandom and stuff. And so it's, if anything, it's more just, hey, it's kind of like, it's almost like a video journal about our time
Right.
doing this, right? You know, and but man, going back to what you said about finding out a couple of months after decanonization, I mean, I've heard that a lot, and I'm always so fascinated by that. And I had in some ways almost the reverse, because I still have like a screenshot of my Facebook from April 22nd, I think, 2014. So a couple days before. And that's when stuff was starting to leak already about how the next film was definitely not going to be based on any sort of existing canon sources, right? You know, continuity, so, you know, pre 2014 continuity sources. And there's just a post to me from that date, a few days before, and I share the article, and I just say, that's it, because it had been brewing for a while. We'd all seen the writing on the wall, and I just say, that's it. I'm officially done with Star Wars.
See, for
So
me,
I kind of called it.
so I was kind of, I wasn't as actively following it, right? Again, I just checked this. I just checked like in August because I was like, oh, what was the update? But for me, it was when they announced two things. The first was that episode 7 was going to be 30 years into the future. So I'm like,
Mm,
okay. And then later they announced the cast of Force Awakens and Peter Mayhew was going to be it. And from then I was just like, okay,
mm,
if Chewbacca's in it, then they're not going to follow this because 30
right.
years later he shouldn't, unless they're going to bring him back. I had that little bit of hope of like, oh, he'll just show up for like a flashback or something, and like but deep down I probably knew.
Yeah.
I was lying to myself.
Yeah, you know, right. And because we we were willing to believe in anything, right? You know, after that point. I mean, after Disney bought thing. I mean, what's interesting too, so in some ways we're already sort of, I think, getting started, because when you really think about how we broke this stuff down, really the story doesn't start in 2014. It really starts pre-2014, right?
Mhm.
In some sense, it can go all the way back to the 70s in some ways, but when you just think about the weird relationship that, say, the fans have always had with, say, Lucasfilm, George Lucas, right? You know, he was pre-2014, always in some sense, every fan's like best friend and worst enemy, right? You know, we would always say, why did you do that? Why did you add the CJ rock in front of R2, right? On the other hand, we loved him. He was the creator, right? You know, but obviously with 2012, with Disney buying Lucasfilm, I mean, there was an interesting, I think, sort of mixed view at the time. I admittedly was very rosy about that. You know, Matt
Mhm.
Wilkins, for instance, talked about how, I mean, he made a video about the day it happened, right? Famous
Mhm.
video. He was pretty nervous, right? I thought, this is great. I go, this is a company that's going to continue this IP into the future. And boy, am I embarrassed to admit that in retrospect, right? And when you really stop to think about, what have they really done a good job at, right? And this is not to bash Disney, but what have they really historically done a good job of in terms of like managing IPs, including their own? I heard Kevin Smith, of all people, years before this, talk about how, like, when you really stop to think about it, like, what had they ever really done with Mickey? When was the last time Mickey Mouse was in a big movie? You know, I mean, growing up, you knew about him because he was in like 15 minutes of Fantasia. Beyond that, what had they done with this character? So in retrospect, we should have seen the writing on the wall. But in any event, you know what really, so again, I wanted to believe that Disney was going to do a good job of this. I wanted to believe that these next series of films are going to be, if not about the Skywalkers, right, then at least in some
Mhm.
sense not inconsistent with everything else. The thing that really made me nervous was, in addition to the leaks here and there, not to mention the talk from the story group about how they were going to be reshuffling canon, it was Star Trek Into Darkness. It was the J.J. Abrams film. And I think in some sense it was J.J. being associated with the films that made me the most nervous. I mean, that's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. But it was a real template in some sense for what I think they wanted him to do, which was to sort of make a film that it was some ways going to sort of broaden the kind of like popularized Star Wars / Star Trek, but also have these like nostalgic appeals. And Star Trek Into Darkness, I don't know if you've seen it. It does neither, right? And I go, wow,
Mhm.
I'm extremely nervous now. And then again, and then it was just starting to become clearer and clearer, and things were leaking pre decanonization day that it really wasn't going to be canon. It was all going to get booted. Um, so okay, so we've got a list here, and you know, no particular order. I think understanding the EU fandom movement at least goes back as far as 2008 with the Filoni Clone Wars,
Mhm.
right? What was your reaction to that at the time? Were you watching that at the time?
Yes. I never saw the movie in theaters. I would see the movie years and years later. Um and as for the Clone Wars show, I did watch it. I was incredibly confused about it, because again, I had grown up with the Tarkovsky Clone Wars, and
Yeah.
although I wasn't that big into the comics and the overall continuity, I knew at the time that the character of Ahsoka was essentially completely destroying all the continuity that there was in the Clone Wars timeline and all the other problems. But as a show, I didn't see that was much that was wrong with it. It was just okay. But how does this fit in with the rest of the story? Those were my
Right.
only complaints at the time.
I've said this all before, but really briefly, I mean, like yourself, being such a huge Tartakovsky fan, in terms of sort of like the capacity to lie to oneself, I had really I'd let myself believe some of the rhetoric that existed around 2007 when we first heard about it at Celebration in LA, and I still have the teaser promo poster for that event. It didn't look exactly like the Tartakovsky animation, but we were led to believe that it was really going to be a stylistic sequel,
Mhm.
right? It was really, in some sense, because I remember thinking, look, like, what more is there to tell in this fashion that we haven't seen elsewhere, either in between the films or in the books and comics and stuff? What more are we going to get? So it baffled me, and I think a lot of others, when we realized, oh, immediately, this doesn't look like it, doesn't feel like it, right? And there are these new characters that don't, like, why the heck are we hearing about a Padawan now? And so, I mean, just none of it really made sense. So that was very disconcerting. And but I still, for a while, was willing to sort of like make this kind of compromise with it as an entity within the continuity, because I saw how it was clearly connecting with kids when I would go to the conventions and celebrations, right?
Mhm.
I would look around and I'd say, okay, that's someone who's dressed as Ahsoka. I'm like, okay, that's someone who there in a couple of years is going to be a Star Wars fan like me. So, okay, that's fine. But I do remember pre 2014 getting this feeling like every time you walked back into a Barnes and Noble to pick up Star Wars Insider or something, that even though Lucasfilm was always about getting more of our money, right? That there was a
Mhm.
sense in which things had really just become cash grabby. The entire magazine was now just an advertisement for this cartoon. The cartoon was an advertisement for the magazine. It was all about kiddie stuff. It was all about Clone Wars. It was, you know what I mean? It was something was changing, right? So uh and that's interesting. I mean, I think separate but related. I mean, I think it is interesting to look back now and to start to sort of identify maybe things we couldn't appreciate at the time, but was there sort of a creeping sense of decay, right? Folks
I
have
think
talked
there
about this
was,
for, yeah.
but it's like it's something I didn't realize, and I know I said this on a bunch of different shows and podcasts, but looking back on it, there is around this time again post TCW, there's a subtle changing of the guard at Lucas Licensing,
Yeah.
where in 3 years basically we lost Steve Sansweet, Sue Restoni, and Howard Rothman. Howard Rothman is still at Lucasfilm, but he basically got moved to the marketing to like a completely different department from Lucas Licensing. What does he do? I have it up here. Yeah, he was president at Lucas Licensing until 2012, and it doesn't say. But he changed departments and is no longer a part of Lucas Licensing. Steve Sansweet left to create
Yep.
Rancho Obi-Wan, and that was announced in 2010. He didn't leave until April of 2011. And then I also think in 2011, yeah, June of 2011 is where Sue Sony also left. So you have these three people who are in the position of the head of being in charge of Lucas Licensing and editing, who are trying to keep all the story together. And then all three of them leave right before the buyout happens. That just to me sounds like a leaving a sinking ship, right? Not to be too conspiratorial, but that's
Right.
three people who, and I have quotes because around this time I don't even have this on here, but I have this thing that floats around. It's on the expandeduniverse.com, the quotes document, which is just all the quotes that Matt's found from his own videos. And I actually
Mhm.
went and compiled them all and like linked to the sources of all these things of going against the various arguments that we were seeing from anti-expanded universe, the anti-EU crowd at the time. And these three were heavily, along with Leland Chi, were the most prolific defenders of it, of saying no, it's within continuity. It is a part of the overall vision and all these stories. And all three of them leave. Then it gets bought out, and then 2 years later, we get the decanonization.
You can't help but wonder, and I really hope someday someone, maybe like a business journalist or something, writes the story about all of this, right? Writes the story about the transition from, one corporation buying another corporation, and how all the pieces start to fit together, and how that sort of like, creates some tension inside, so people leave. I'd like to know the business story as a business story about like what are the things that go into ultimately the decanonization itself. There's an interesting corporate story to tell there. And some of these things I think are sort of certain indicators, right, of some of the mess that must have been happening inside, that whether they were fully conscious of or not. I mean, it's interesting to go back and sort of see the pattern, right? And sort of, and there's, of course, it's true just narratively too. I mean, there are certainly sort of fans that would now argue that like maybe some of the books started sort of dipping in quality, maybe some of the
comics,
the comics, right? The Dark Horse stuff. We started getting like an endless stream of like the Darth Vader miniseries and things like this, some of which I really like. Some of like Ghost Prison, I think is really good. Some of which maybe a little cash grabby, right? Towards the very end of Dark Horse 2, you start getting things that sadly never got a chance because they were getting, they were still in publication as the decanonization announcements were happening, Rebel Heists and stuff. But were those comics that were really going to be sort of like altering the course of EU continuity? Were those going to be the next Dark Empires? Not really, right? So yeah, very, very weird stuff. Very unfortunate. Of course, this raises the larger question, which we can just bookmark for now, but there is this growing sense that we sort of feel like lots of younger fans now seem to be arguing that, well, maybe in the end, all of this was a good thing. And I think that's what's so interesting. I think that as we start to move into sort of like the early part of the history of the EU fandom post 2014, I think that one of the most striking, we talked about this before, one of the most striking differences, I think, between now and then is the attitude about continuing the EU. I think you and I are pretty aligned. Like the answer unequivocally is yes, right? You can give me any counter argument, I'd still say it's worth seeing what continuation looks like. Increasingly, lots of people, for a variety of reasons, including for the reasons that we just offered, who look back pre-2014 and start to see sort of like entropy and writing on the wall, they just go, yeah, maybe it was a good thing that was all ended. That's something that I can't recognize that as a fan. It's weird, but that seems to be like a growing sort of new consensus in the fandom. Striking, right?
Yeah. So anything else from that early like pre
I think it's important, just to stick with the Clone Wars for a second, I think it's important to remind folks, particularly because this stuff has started to disappear just for, a variety of reasons. Stuff it wasn't like cached or archived or whatever, right? Forums have come down, the Star Wars forums have come down, Dark Horse forums have come down, Wizards of the Coast forums have come down. But there were a number of promises by Leland Chi in these forums. And folks have probably heard this before, although it's getting increasingly hard to find proof of this, but just so folks know for the record, it's true. He responded to things like the petition of the 2000, right? Which is sort of inspired by like the, like the Revenge of the Sith sort of petition of senators to Palpatine and stuff. There was a Facebook group, the petition of the 2000, that basically said from the start, right, of 2008 Clone Wars, right? Something's up. And as a matter of fact, like we found out pretty quickly that like, as a matter of fact, like the first season wasn't even in chronological order within itself, right? You know what I mean? We needed like the season 1 reference guide to make sense of that. But lots of fans, lots of loyal, hardcore, long-term EU fans had said, Chi, what's up, man? And he said, I get it. Don't worry, when this is all over, we'll make sense of it, right? And as we've often said, one of the most unfortunate things about the decanonization is that it effectively mooted that retcon ever coming, right? So, but it's just important to remember that Lucasfilm was aware of what impact this was leaving on the fandom. Again, you noted like Sue and Steve and Howard leaving, right? And I think the one final thing too is just to sort of like reiterate for folks who haven't heard this before, but April 25th, 2014 was a shock, but we, again, for a variety of reasons, knew something was coming. The story group, not even secretively, had been put together to assess the state of continuity and canon going forward.
And that was
Now,
before that's April. They had announced like several months before Story Group is going to, and then that was like when the theory was, oh, they're going to pick and choose what parts are going to be kept and whatnot.
Yeah. Excuse me. And by the way, and I've made a video a number of years ago. I try and make the silver lining out of that there was a realistic alternative world in which an April 25th comes, and what they say is something complicated like, okay, this book is canon, but this book isn't anymore. This section is, but this character is, and this is right. You know, by just wholesale saying it's over, they in principle sort of allow us to sort of like argue for two separate continuities, right? You know. So that was ended up in the good thing, but the really brief history here to remember too is this was not again, and they were open about this, right? This was something we're going to do because this wasn't the first time they had done this. When Leland Shee comes about to sort of construct the holocron, to sort of like shore up a lot of sort of like the confusion for licensees about what are the sorts of things they can write about, not write about, right? That was effectively them doing something like this. You know, there have been lots of phases where Lucasfilm had effectively sort of reshuffled what canon was. Prior to 2000, what canon meant was a little bit more like what we feared back in the day, when like Courtship of Princess Leia all of a sudden provides a superficial contradiction to the Jedi Prince series because of the wedding. Well, Jedi Prince was now on a literal list at Lucasfilm of non-canon works, right? Until the 2000 holocron innovation, right? Which then sort of breaks up everything into the hierarchy of canon and whatnot. So what they were talking about pre-2014 could have looked something like that, right? To sort of a re-rationalization of how it was all going to look. But again, I think the thing that did shock everybody was the wholesale decanonization, and as I'm often also fond of pointing out, more importantly, the discontinuation. I think that's the real crime. That's the real crime in all of this. Yes. Call it whatever you want. I don't, you know, I see lots of new things now, EU elitist style book guides to how to talk about this stuff rhetorically. I don't care what you call it, canon or not. The fact that they ended it, that's the problem, right? So, but I think from my point of view, I mean, I think those are the big pieces pre sort of 2014, pre Death Star day, right?
And that's actually a great segue into Death Star Day, because I remember that was one of the first conversations of, okay, what do we want? Because there was some people that were pushing for, they wanted EU canon again. Then there was the continuity. Then there was the screw all that, we're going to move on to the new stuff. And this kind of almost civil war in the fandom that started completely overnight, of so many different fan sites and like high profile people in the community that were kind of in a little bit of positions of power, not at Lucasfilm specifically, but like higher, like you know, like the Wikipedias, the Force.nets, these kind of places that overnight basically completely sold out and turned on the EU community.
Instantaneously. Yep.
And that, like, because I remember one of the things that'll become a recurring thing is one of the Facebook groups that, at least in the early, and even some of them, and to a lesser extent in the mid days of the movement, that was very fundamental in a lot of the stuff happening, was the Alliance. That started because the 10 people who started that group were all in another EU group that had been fully EU. Then the decanonization happened, and they said, we're not going to support this anymore. We're gonna go up to the new thing. And then they felt like they had been betrayed, and they made their own group. And that group that was one of dozens of Facebook groups that came up. But it just happened to be that one was the one that caught the most traction and brought most people in. But that's how it was back then.
Yeah, and just a quick point. I mean, an interesting thing about this is so much of well, first of all, it's interesting. Pre-2014, there really wasn't much of a movement, right? It's interesting to use that terminology. There was a Star Wars fandom, and there was an EU fandom within that fandom. But it's really post-April 2014 that there's now really an idea of a movement inside the fandom. And you're right, then it has to sort of, even there's a civil war within the Star Wars fandom, a civil war within the EU fandom, and then even within the EU movement, then there's a really important debate about, well, what do we actually want? And you mentioned something that I'd completely forgotten about, which is that for a while, particularly in 2014, and it kind of died out in sort of a really mainline way by about 2015, but there are very serious people inside the EU movement who were arguing that our goal needs to be to reinstitute the EU as
Mhm.
canon, to effectively argue that this movie that's coming out next year, should just be thrown in the can or something. And
Right. And
I mean, yeah,
they're a very small minority, but it seems like any person you would argue with would automatically think that that was what you were
yeah,
trying to go and immediately dismiss. It's like, no, 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 it's impossible. And it was like a multi-year process of like educating people of like, we know that's not possible. We know that, but we just want these
yeah,
stories to be continued. We don't
yeah,
care if they're official canon or not. It's all, but it's all the continuity. And again, that was another thing about, because people who were in the Star Wars fandom but didn't know much about the EU were now on board, and it was also like having to educate people about what it is we had lost, what it is we wanted, and what we were actually trying to do.
yes, yeah. Yeah, and in the process, right, like, I mean, it was really like a multi-front war, right? So there are these instantaneous overnight haters now coming at us, right? From
Mhm.
the outside who aren't EU fans, right? Or maybe who were were fans, but not any, or not fans of the movement. But then there's this like internal battle too. So it's this multi-pronged war. And I mean, there's a multi-year process where just rhetorically we get to a point where we kind of all are starting to sort of agree on some of the major aims and even language and stuff. And as I've argued too, even I mean, this is something that I think that's hard to remember now. It's easy to take for granted. Even the idea that there are two canons, right, or two
Mhm.
continuities, whatever, right, that Legends is a distinct continuity. Of course, it's implicitly the case in principle that because of the way they decanonized, well, there is now this separate bucket of content that can go off in a different direction. But from Lucasfilm's perspective, it was basically all just ruled end canon and just a big, trash can of ideas for them to sort of rip off for their storyline, right? They viewed it the way that pre 2014 Del Rey would have viewed something in S canon, right?
Mhm.
We and again, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but I really feel like rhetorically that was something that, in addition to having to fight sort of even EU movement fans about the idea of like, no, we don't want to reinstitute as canon, we want to continue it, right? In order to argue that, you had to then convince them as well as outsiders, right? And ultimately Lucasfilm know that there actually is a distinct continuity that can be continued in parallel, right? I don't
Mhm.
think in the beginning 2014 that was something that you could take for granted. That was something I think we had to fight for. Do you think
Mhm.
that's true too?
Yeah, it's something you had to fight for. And again, it's like a fight. There was two fights, right? There was the actual going out and like saying, no, we want this. And then
Hmm.
there would be eventually be pushback, and pushback from people who didn't know what they were pushing back to us. And then this lengthy process of like educating, like you would get into these arguments, and then these arguments would eventually devolve into you being like, no, it was like this, like it with these long drawn out like explanations of like what it is the EU is, what it and
Hmm.
and all these things, and then sometimes, and a lot of times a lot of times they would just like shut you down, or you would never even get to be that far. And another thing, as we talked about with the civil wars within the fandom, there were we're not going to name names,
No,
even though
no,
we don't know names, but there were certain people who were active in the community at the time who, over time, essentially became rogue elements for it. That
sure.
unfortunately made a bad name for the rest of us, and would go out
Yeah,
and do things, and then it's like a 2 to 3 year process of like damage control on telling people like, no, that they don't represent us, that's not what we're trying to do, we don't agree with them, this is what we're after. And there's,
yeah.
yeah.
It was well said, and to this day, some of those elements still come up, and particularly because some of those rogue elements got a lot of attention, more attention than actually I think like the more positive sides of the fandom did, more attention than like Twin Sons charitable giving gives, right? I mean,
Mhm.
some of these rogue elements are known by like celebrities at Lucasfilm. I mean, it got to crazy sorts of places, right? And that was really unfortunate. So
This is getting ahead of time, but when when we had Twin Sons, when we had Twin Sons, uh, filled out the application to go to a fan table at Celebration Orlando, the first ever celebration. Uh, the president of Lucasfilm had a phone call with Brian, where Brian had to explain to him about, again, because of all these various rogue elements that had done things either through social media or at other conventions. And Brian, I don't know what exactly went down in that conversation, but Brian basically had to talk and convince him that no, we weren't that we weren't going to do that, and that we were going to be like respectful. And I think he was kind of forced to make that conversation because of other people, and I think
Sure.
he was relatively on our side. But the fact that that was still a phone call that had to have and a conversation that had to get had is a is a is huge, and there is like just shows the magnitude of like how thoroughly we had to fight for our own reputation within of the
Absolutely.
movement's reputation in those
You
early
know,
days.
and by the way, just to clarify for anyone who's watching this who's trying to deconstruct this, not the president of Lucasfilm, that's Kathleen Kennedy, but yeah, I think wasn't it probably the head of, wasn't it
Head
like
of
the
fan
head of
relations, yeah.
head of fan relations, right? And I think it's fair to say that Twin Sons, and hopefully by extension, the positive elements of the EU movement, I think, are now considered effectively kind of part of the family, right? You know, and I think for anyone who is that still, you think, fair to say, or at least was at one
Yeah.
point? Yeah. I mean, in other words, the work you guys did, and that fighting that Brian had to do, and then the work you guys subsequently did as Twin Sons, I think, um, it seemed like after all that fighting, it seemed like it was paying off a little bit, right? That
Mhm.
finally some sort of the clouds were parting. But it's true. There clearly are some forces like Lucasfilm that like look, because there's they run Star Wars too. You know, some of them were
Mhm.
around pre 2014. They're probably, you know, missed the old days too and stuff. So there were definitely people who wanted to sort of assume good faith. But yeah, it just goes to show how far and how well sort of the termites had dined. You know what I mean? Inside
Yeah.
the public opinion about what we were all up to and stuff like that. And by the way, not to jump ahead, but this is all pre like fandom menace stuff too, where it's like, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, now we've got to fight up an even bigger hill
Yeah,
to
we
convince
were
people
we were
that we're not
talking
a
about this we were talking about this before the stream, but we were just like, remember what it was like to be an expanded universe like fan and like in the EU movement before The Last Jedi made it cool to like not like what Disney was doing?
yes,
Do you
yes.
remember when you were the weirdo for saying, "Look, I've got some questions with how they're handling the franchise."
Yeah.
Like,
It's one of those things you just if only you could bottle that time,
right.
and no one will appreciate it. It was yeah, it was it was a lonely place to be, you know what I mean? And I guess I'm proud of everyone who stuck through it during that time, because that's not an easy that's
No.
not an easy position to be in, either collectively or individually, right? Because and the thing to really clarify is both collectively and individually, the EU fandom and EU fans were daily attacked for no reason, right?
Mhm.
By people, many of whom, as you pointed out, on April 24th, 2014, were a part of the EU establishment, but the day after
Right.
decided to sort of join the cultural sort of majority, you know, with the cultural power and the blue check marks and everything else on Twitter, whatever, to come
Mhm.
out. It was an amazing turn of events. And again, as we've often said, all we did was wake up one day and find out that the stories we wanted to keep reading had been
Had been canceled.
unceremonious. Yeah, and you know, not to seem bitter, but the only thing I would add into like maybe the very beginning of this section of this, right, is the unbelievably ham-fisted way in which Death Star Day actually came about. I mean, the announcement was just so bad, you know. And I've said to the point that I would actually probably retire from the EU fandom and EU movement if all they did was re-message that in a way that actually, I don't know, made slightly more sense
Mhm.
or something, right? You know, or didn't just like make it look
Oh,
at
especially because of the video. Remember that video they
the
made at the
video.
same time?
That's right.
That oh, that had basically Timothy Zahn and a bunch of other people you'd never heard of talking about how great it was, and but like it's gone now and we're gonna do these
Sure.
all new exciting things, and like it's
30
so tone deaf, honestly.
absolutely. Absolutely. It just absolutely right. I mean, it was just it's like, oh my gosh, like how was this the same company that was overseeing a licensing effort that for 37 and a half years had given us all of these things, right? And was
Hmm.
whatever you think about like the last couple of years of Dark Horse content or Del Rey content, what have you, right? Was nonetheless still I mean, look at those last couple of years. Plagueis, Kenobi, SWTOR. I mean, Star Wars was still moving along, right? And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, one day we wake up and you're right, we get this horrible video from a couple of like people they just trotted there like turkeys to what basically highlight the Thrawn trilogy and like Dark Empire. And
Hmm.
then Filoni says something about like Splinter of the Mind's Eye or something, likes the cover, and it's like, oh
Because
wow,
again,
yeah,
it's such an interesting thing because that was I think their target audience was the people who only like have a vague recollection of what the EU is, because
Hmm.
I think all of Star Wars fans at that time generally knew that there was more than just the movies and had a passing knowledge of some of it, but
Yeah.
didn't quite understand the extent that it went. So they'd say, "Oh yeah, Timothy Zahn in Dark Empire." It's like, you know, the two E works that they were probably familiar with outside of some video games.
Yeah.
I think, and that was their target audience. I believe. Looking back on it, yeah.
Hmm. It's interesting too, if gosh, if we started this like with almost like a real prehistory of 2014. I mean, it's another thing for like maybe newer fans to be, it's hard for them to appreciate, but a real glory like era in my personal sort of Star Wars fandom is like those old days of the old Star Wars.com,
Hmm.
where among other things at the very top, there was a specific little section drop down for just the expanded universe, right? So it's one of those things that like as a Star Wars fan, if you're there engaging in this new media sort of platform they have to talk about the new films and the prequels and the merch and what's coming up on TV shows and DVD release and stuff, also for the EU too. I mean, you were always very aware that this was one of the pillars really of the Star Wars
Hmm.
franchise, right? But ultimately, you're right. I think it became clear and clear who that video and who that messaging about decanonization was really ultimately for. So
I have one of my many regrets is because I can remember in the good old days, I can remember going to bookstores, and I've lived all over the country. We moved around a lot. We had family everywhere, so I've been to places, and I've been back there like years and years later. I remember no matter what bookstore I went to, the Star Wars section was an entire aisle. There was
yes.
one entire aisle of Star Wars books, and then slowly, like that kept up all the way until about 2015, and then in 2015 it started shrinking until now most bookstores have between 1 and 2 cases like of the aisle. Like it's usually like 1.5, it's like one full case and then like two
Hmm.
shelves of another case is like the
Hmm.
Star Wars section. And I want to go back in time, and I want to like I want like a photo collage of like the year by year of the Star
Sure.
Wars section at like my library in my hometown, or one of or where my parents live right now, that I'd go to, of like just how it's decayed over the years.
It'd be a powerful visual. Now, I mean, of course, in fairness, some of this is about just the decay of what, like, brick and mortar
Breeding, yeah,
shopping and the
right.
breeding. Absolutely. People always make fun of me, but I make this point all the time. There is a major sociological sort of, I distinct distinction between us and I think, like, frankly, and it's no value judgment. It's just true between us and people who are just like from a younger generation. Do young people even read anymore? I mean, to be honest, you know what I mean? But no, but I mean, like bookstores are in decline and book sales and stuff are in decline too. But then again, go back and the famous video of Zahn and Alston, I think it's at an early Star Wars celebration, right? Where they're being asked about
Star
is
Wars Fan Days 4, I believe
oh,
it
it was
was.
fan days. That's right. That's right. Are they asked, like, is a reboot possible, right? And what does Zahn say? Like famously, right? He goes, the publishing industry has taken enough of a hit as it already is, right? And I think it's interesting to speculate about what would have happened if folks like us were continuing to every day go into the bookstore to see what new
Hmm.
stuff is out, right, and continue to buy.
And
So yeah, it's
and again, that's a great segue, I think, that concept into some of the early battles we had with the movement about not only what we were, but what we should be doing. Because I remember there was a
yeah,
big right off the bat, the first thing everyone thought of was, okay, boycott. We're not going to
uh-huh,
watch any of the stuff. We're not going to buy any of
right,
the new books. I think that was a no brainer because most of us at that point had no interest in it. And some people were kind of only, it was kind of a little bit of a debate of like, uh, so currently in our current day, there's like this thing about like, oh, no hate watching with like the new Rings of
yeah,
Power thing.
right,
That's like a
right,
meme. But we unironically had that conversation back in like 2014 with like with Rebels with the new books. You know,
hmm,
no hate reading. Like we need to show that we need to prove to them financially that this is not a good decision. That we're not going to support these books, and that on the other hand, that we are going to support Legends books. So one thing I remember early on was book buys where would have like
yeah,
organized we'd have a day where we were like, okay, we're all going to go, we're all going to buy this book at this hour to get the Amazon sales to show that it's a bestseller for like that hour. And like, we're not, they were ultimately unsuccessful because a lot of people already had the books and didn't have a reason to buy another copy of the book.
exactly, yeah.
And, and there was only so much we could do. Little would we know, again, almost 7, 8 years later, what Heart of the Jedi would do to the Amazon sales. And
Oh yeah.
that's actually a prequel, because again, I helped run those, and I was the one who would be updating the Amazon site every hour. So through that, I actually got to learn how the Amazon bestsellers ranks work, which I just had to
Mm.
keep all that in my back of my mind until the Heart of the Jedi started
To be
trending
able
in
to
that
analyze
direction.
that. Yeah. This is jumping ahead a little bit too, but I remember that's one reason why I went out and was very excited to go out whenever was it 2015, 2016, when those, frankly, in retrospect, sort of pointless Thrawn trilogy reissues came out with the new covers, right?
Hmm.
I was super excited to finally buy something with a Legends banner on it, right? Now, it was pointless because I already had those in multiple different editions, but I remember that sense of like, great, this is one of our rare chances for everyone to go
Hmm.
out and get something that no one else has because it's this new edition, right? And there was something fun about going back and actually buying something Star Wars again for the first time in like 2 years, whatever. Of course,
Hmm.
we had that feeling again with like Marvel 108 and some other things down the road too. But yeah, but the boycott versus like, it's funny. I've made videos too. Like I just, for a variety of like bizarre reasons, I just personal reasons and economic reasons, I could bore people about. Like I'm not really like a huge fan of boycotting. My argument was I like Star Wars because I like the EU. This new stuff isn't the EU. It's not that I'm boycotting. It's that I wouldn't get it anyway. And what I think is interesting is like this kind of relates to this weird sort of misunderstanding that we've also had to sort of like have debate about sort of inside our own movement. Is like from the very beginning there was this belief, I don't know where it came from, just people's intuition, which I don't think has been very well sort of empirically tested, that like unless we did follow both canons, right?
Hmm.
Lucasfilm would never give us more of the old, which never
Right.
seemed logical at all to me, right? But there was this from the start, there was this sense that like, well, if you were going to start a Facebook page for the EU movement, right, you have to then talk about the new canon too. Because you got to be open-minded. You got to invite more people in, right? And I think the argument often we would make is like literally every single other web page, social media account, et cetera, on the entire internet is doing stuff for the new canon. Can't there be one or two places just for the
Hmm.
EU fans, right? But again, that was seen as like somehow closed-minded. The notion that I wasn't boycotting the new stuff. I wasn't ever going to follow it because I wanted more of the old. But then I was being told that I was part of the problem by not wanting to read A New Dawn or watch
Hmm.
Rebels and what did people say to us every day in 2015? Oh, come on. You're going to see the films. Oh, come on.
Yeah,
I
you'll
know,
get
right?
over it. You'll get over
Yeah.
it. You're gonna
Yeah.
see the movie, and that's we'll get into this when we get to the billboard, but that's a lot of the timing of the billboard. The reason we held off on that for so long was because of that, because we
Yeah.
wanted it to come out after the movie had come out. Because again, the prevailing thought at the time was that
Boom.
they thought when the Force Awakens comes out, we're all going to go away. We're all going to get in line and we're all going to be like, "Wow, this is great." And that was the timing of the billboard was specifically not only to say, "Hey, we want this," but to prove we saw your movie. We're not or your movie came out, it had no effect. We still want this. This is what we want.
Yeah. That's right. And I remember after that, by the way, then we kind of all had to start arguing. Now that they've gone through with this, they're obviously gonna complete the trilogy. So now we have to
Right.
wait till 2019, right? You know, but
Right.
um, but
It's
it's funny though. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
it's very patient. We have to be very patient. And I
Very
think a lot of
patient.
people also the newer people because we also had that back in 2014, 2015. And maybe we had this because we've been around here long, but like this is not going to be a battle that's going to be won overnight, right?
No.
Our victories are going to be slow. They're going to be great. They're going to feel great, but they're going to be slow
Yeah.
coming and it's going
Yep.
to be a while. We almost have to essentially wait out
Yep.
until we have to wait out all these storms.
Yep. That's right. We can be the constant variable, right? I mean, I think ultimately it's like, look, well, I don't know how to say this. Like, we didn't do anything wrong, right?
Mhm.
We were hardcore fans buying everything, giving Lucasfilm every one of our last dollars, right? Pre 2014, post 2014, we said, why did you take this away? We're still here with money. In fact, we keep jumping ahead of the billboard, but like, I will give money so that kids can put
Mhm.
up a billboard to tell you how much more money we want to spend on other things. But
Mhm.
it's like, um, where was I going with that? I forget. What was I saying?
We had to be patient.
Just patient, yeah. But Oh, but again, but we're the constant variable in some sense, right? Again, we didn't do anything, and every once in a while too, it's really funny when people will come back and say, "Well, you're running the movement wrong. You've got the wrong tactics," or again, like to the point about like, "No, you should be following both canons because otherwise they're not going to give you more of the
Hmm.
older." It's like, no, it's just like that the logical implication there is that like if we need to do something different, it's because we did something wrong in the first place, right? That like they took Legends, they took EU away almost to punish us or something. No, it's like they changed their mind
Hmm.
when they change it again, or when management completely changes over, or when nostalgia becomes just too much of a good thing and a good opportunity to print money, we will still be here. And that's part of the goal. We need to be, I mean, ultimately too, like we're the last pillar holding up the EU. George is
Hmm.
gone. All those Lucasfilm licensing folks you mentioned at the top are gone. None of the old EU authors really, except for Zahn, are ever invited back in. We're it. We're the pillar holding them up, but that's okay because we can, if we can outlast, right?
Hmm.
Eventually this stuff is going to come back. At least that's the argument I would make. But it is interesting just to go back briefly to the whole argument about like how we kind of as a movement decided pretty early on, like, yeah, like don't hate watch the new stuff. And frankly too, it's like, yeah, why would you? Again, it's just not the EU. We don't want to go into it. And by the
Hmm.
way, remember, A New Dawn, the first new canon book, did not do very well compared to a lot of
Yes.
other. So that is interesting. So there's something going on there, right?
It
But
took until Aftermath for them to actually start making New York Times bestsellers again, and that
yeah,
came with a huge amount of marketing, which is a bit again later down the line, but at least in our
it,
timeline, we're still in 2014.
I know there's a lot of history here, but no, it's interesting. Like every once in a while, I'll still see some fans be like, "Yeah, like no, I'm a hardcore EU fan," and who self-identify as an active member of this thing they call a movement inside the Star Wars fandom to continue the EU. But then they'll say, "Oh yeah, but I kind of dabble with the new canon too," and that's so fascinating to me. It's something's kind of shifted there, right? Where there was a time when, for right or wrong, not making a value judgment for right or wrong, I think there was sort of a consensus that like in this little movement. It's like, yeah, like don't by all means, if you enjoy it, but don't do it because you feel like you have to. And it's fascinating how this many years now post decanonization, with this much new canon content now, there's something. It just goes to show the power that this brand Star Wars has. That over time, it's been able to sort of work its way into the wallets and minds and hearts of like otherwise hardcore EU fans to some degree, right? Where they're kind of like, you know what? Sure, you know what? I'll go check out Mandalorian. And you know what? And what the heck? It was a fun show. And isn't it neat to see Boba Fett pop up here and there and stuff like
Hmm.
that? And again, no value judgment. If that's what you like, that's what you like. But it just, again, it's so interesting. It's like, I guess I'm just saying, it's like, it just goes to show how hard, how resolute you have to be to kind of wait this out, right? You know what I mean? Because in the same way that I think I'd like to argue that we're always going to be here waiting for the new stuff, right? Lucasfilm's always going to be ready with, another opportunity to try and recoup its $4 billion, right? Or Disney with its
Hmm.
$4 billion, so it's like they're going to keep throwing stuff at fans, right? And it just goes to show the
Hmm.
power of like Star Wars being in your feed every day, whether you want it or not, right? And that's ultimately one of the weirdest things about being a Star Wars fan, but not a fan of the main Star Wars stuff happening now, is that everybody knows what Star Wars is, right? And how many
Hmm.
times, how many Christmases, for instance, the last 8 years, have you been given new canon Star Wars stuff, right? Someone
Hmm.
gives you like Kylo Ren socks, and you're kind of like, oh, right, thanks, because they just go,
Yes,
well, you
you
like
have to
Star
have.
Wars, right?
Yeah, you like Star Wars, and you're like, well, kinda.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, it's complicated, right? So,
It's
but
complicated. I love that answer. It's the talk. Oh my gosh! I remember there was the meme at that time of like the talk of like, because again, new canon didn't really exist yet, right? But it's like, well, you
yeah.
like Star Wars, and it's like, well, and then you had to give them the whole explanation about everything of like, ah,
Yeah. I mean, again, I feel like so many people are going to be watching this and feel like, yep, I've had that. I probably still have that conversation, right? So,
yep.
so I'm looking at our list now, and I'm just gonna roll through some of this just to like put it out there, and we can kind of come back to any of this. So, there's Death Star Day, April 25th, 2014. Facebook groups and all sorts of social media pages proliferate. My recollection is that Facebook really seemed to be kind of the prime platform at the
Yeah,
time, and I
that
think
was
that's
ground zero at the beginning, was
totally
Facebook.
right. Yeah, and I tell me if I'm wrong, but it really feels like that's not true anymore.
No, it's not. And I think
Yeah.
again, I think the reason why was it ties into the fan sites because the fan sites all turned on us
Hmm.
and we couldn't and they were the ones who controlled the platform. Wikipedia
Hmm.
controlled their platform. Uh the StarWars.com. They controlled the platform. We couldn't go to where we would normally congregate to talk about this thing without getting without getting flamed, outvoted, or moderated. So Facebook was at the time the only really real major social media site that we could go to talk about these things and at least have the platform let us talk about these things, which
True.
is, with all the things about Facebook nowadays, is weird to say. But back then, it was that neutral arbiter. It was that only place that we could really go and we could find other people, and where the site wouldn't just block us for saying bad things about Star Wars and Disney, where we could find other people who were interested in Star Wars. And I think that was a big reason why Facebook was ground zero, at least in the early days.
I think that's right, and it kind of relates to, I think you might have just alluded to this, but I mean, like the fact that even like literally the forums, like the internet. I mean, it's funny, younger fans aren't going to really appreciate
StarWars.com forums. It didn't exist anymore. They closed them off. We couldn't.
And Facebook, particularly Facebook groups, was really the closest thing that we had at the time, social media wise, to something that was like forum-esque in its ability to sort of like create threads and go back and forth about discussion topics. It's funny. I just feel like younger fans just do not remember, and will never appreciate what forum life was like. There's something close to it now, which is like Discord and places like that, right? But that's so segregated. Everyone has their own. Back in the day, there were 3 or 4, the Force.net forums, again, Wizards of the Coast, Cuphead, but like the StarWars.com forums, right? That was the place to be. And the point was everyone could see these conversations, right? Everyone could benefit from them, right? So, but okay, so the proliferation of that, obviously too, the emergence of YouTube channels, it's so interesting. I remember in 2014, Googling around on YouTube, things like, Star Wars EU. Of course, you'd find Matt, but you know what else you'd find? You'd find a bunch of just sort of like geek vloggers who would just have like the dismissive thing to say about, well, yeah, it was silly. They had they had crying mountains. It was probably time for it to be decanonized, right? Just for fun, I Googled that tonight again. And obviously it's a completely different world, right? There's more of our stuff than there is of just like mainstream stuff. But YouTube becomes a major place, right? Obviously, Matt's a huge part of that. The establishment of almost the brand, the EU rebellion, that becomes almost a public facing descriptor for what we do, which I think is kind of interesting. You'll sometimes see that still. That was obviously a big part of the branding then, right? We talked about this splits in fandom over the direction of that rebellion, right? Of course, splits about various social media groups and stuff. We could go into an entire video about that, but the way all these groups, the alliances, the new alliance, this, that, the other, right? Breakoffs and stuff. And that's just your typical social media / fandom movement stuff. Yeah.
Also, big members of them, people leaving for various reasons. Some of them didn't even have to deal with the movement. There are a lot of people who were doers back in the day that I remember and I was good friends with that are just no longer in because they essentially got too busy to spend all their time on the internet arguing about these things and going out and organizing. And I sometimes think, oh man, it'd be really nice to I wonder what they're doing, how they're all right, and if they've been following any of what's been going on.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. No, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, I've taken my own mental health breaks from the fandom in various ways and stuff like that. And it's really funny, by the way, this is how much my life has changed since 2014. I got married and have had 5 kids. I mean, it's like life is, so it's funny. In the very beginning, I had a lot of time to mix it up in those Facebook groups and things like that everywhere else, right? But it's like, it's hard to kind of squeeze this stuff into real life. But man, it's funny, being involved in all that. I'm so grateful I've gotten to meet people like you and stuff. And so it's like, even when I have to take my breaks, I would miss you guys too much, and all of this kind of shared history and all that kind of stuff. And again, I've always said this, like, we really have Disney to thank for actually getting to like meet other EU fans, you know what I mean? So, but okay. So the big thing we haven't talked about, like, head on, is the Legends rebranding.
Again, civil wars within the fandoms. What to do with the Legends banner? The EU purist of I will not have the banner on my bookshelf versus we need to support this now. We need to get these to show that they're still selling. And that whole debate, which again, we don't have this debate anymore. I think everyone's in the camp of they're fine with the banner. With the new stuff, but having to convince people like, no, go out, buy the books with the banner, because that shows them what we want.
I like the way that Matt Wilkins puts it. Like, he thinks the banner, it's a badge of quality, right? You know what I mean? And And yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I saw that, I just said it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'm not going to do it. I also took it
Mhm.
uh, I almost took it personally, because I just remember thinking, for all the fans, again, like, I was in the privileged position to have everything. I was never gonna have to buy a Legends book. But the thing is, like, for those who wanted to put the collection together, like, they were gonna have a mix of books with the on the spine, right? And some there's some not. I just remember thinking, you're doing something to a group of fans who are kind of nerdy, kind of on the spectrum, right? Who are particular about these sorts of things, who are not gonna that's gonna drive them crazy. And I just remember thinking,
Mhm.
oh, and it drove me crazy too. But I pretty quickly got over it, right? And it was sort of, and again, I think that's what actually made it even easier for us to make the case amongst ourselves, and then to outsiders, and hopefully ultimately Lucasfilm, that there is a distinct thing called Legends, that is a continuity that can continue in parallel to the new canon, right? So again, in a weird way, it's just a licensing marketing tool, right? Because, by the way, people have made a lot out of it. Even today, you still get in debates about, oh, what does it mean? It's just a tool. But again, it's something that rhetorically they gave us that I think we can give back to them in a way that ultimately helps us, make the argument to continue, right? But those debates were fierce. And of course, it's largely settled, but there's still some people
Mhm.
who go out there to this day who say you shouldn't even use the term and stuff like that. And again, I get where they're coming from, but I just think, like, in the, whatever, right? I mean, but it clearly, in the early days, boy, was that a big deal. Um, Already alluded to this, but then of course, like, everything got re-released, but not everything. That's the thing. But most things got re-released with the Legends banner, right? And it's so
Mhm.
sad, because it was an interesting lesson, I think, for a lot of people, and how a lot of these licensees and stuff. And the same is true with, like, music companies and stuff. Like, when they do reissues, none of these companies keep the art files, so you can see on most of the Legends reissues, the paperbacks, the size is off, the font's different, the images are fuzzy. You know why? Because they had to get some pristine copy from some fan and make a a copy of it. That's, you know what I mean? They do it all the time. Like, fans send in, like, oh, yeah, let me give you my promo poster for the Aerosmith album that's going to go in the box set, because no one in the Aerosmith company has it anymore, and no one at
Mhm.
Sony kept it. Right? It all gets thrown out. You know what I mean? So it's kind of sad, but um, we talked about EU haters coming out of the woodwork. Um, and the beginning of kind of some of the Lucasfilm licensee gaslighting too, a bit about, like, um all of a sudden, arguments about, again, instead of a lot of them just being upfront about, hey, ultimately this was just a big corporate decision that probably largely had to do with JJ Abrams wanting just to sort of, like, be free to create a film that didn't have to sort of connect in any way. Just, instead of being anything more lofty than that, it just, like, they wanted to make it start to seem as if there were lots of reasons, right, that this should have happened, right? You know what I mean, and stuff. And all of a sudden, it just seemed like we were fighting, in addition to all the other people, both internally and externally. We were starting to even fight some of the licensees in Lucasfilm too. It almost felt like as if they had turned overnight, right?
Mhm.
But do you want to hit on the Eric Geller article? I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, so I mentioned this in the stream a while ago. So again, back to the force.net, Eric Geller, one of the writers to it, he got out around, this was, I think, in um, August or September, maybe even October of the move of 2014. And he reached out to a lot of members of a lot of the people, like he reached out to Matt, he reached out to
Yep.
a bunch of the people who were in Mynock's Nest, which we'll talk to about in a bit,
Yes. Yes.
about like, hey, what do you to talk to? Like, hey, I just want to talk. What do you guys want? What is it you're trying to do? And I want to write an article about you guys. And everyone just went in and said, oh yeah, this is, and they told him, and he took all those quotes and then he took a bunch of things that we were saying online in the various double raids and
Yep.
essentially wrote a hit piece on us
Yep.
about this is from anger leads to hate. I remember was the inside the Star Wars expanded universe movement. I think was the title of it.
He clearly had that title in mind before he did the research. I
Mhm.
mean, he knew what he was doing, right? Yeah.
And like the complete like backlash of like, oh, we thought we were gonna get our time in the sun, and then now this guy just comes out and writes a hate article about us. And I guess learning that we can't really trust people
No.
outside of like that.
No, and
And
and again, for anyone who is who's watching this who maybe doesn't spend a lot of time at the force.net, which I don't imagine a lot of EU fans do anymore, the thing that's hard to appreciate is pre-2014, the force.net was like the New York Times for Star Wars fans. Right? It was the go-to fan site, right? It was a
Mhm.
respectable place that did just as much work to promote the EU as we're all doing now. So everyone went in thinking, wow, fantastic, a platform to sort of at least show our side, right? And all to
Mhm.
the contrary. It's horrible. Yeah.
And then again, it was part of that reputation that we had to fight against was, oh, it's just like this. Again, taking quotes out of context. I got quoted. I wasn't even interviewed, and like there, you can find like a quote from one of the rebel raids from me on that article if you look hard enough.
Yeah. And John Sadler, by the way, who you also are. That's just a joke for Jeremy when he watches this.
I miss John. That was like who I was talking about. Like, oh, I wonder how he was doing.
Oh yeah, right.
He was one of them.
Yep. There was a few. Like, was he the one that joined the Marines, or was that there was someone
Yeah,
back then? Yeah.
no, he was already in it. He was one of
He
the
was
10 that he was one of the 10 that started the alliance.
right. Right. Um, so in no particular order here, one thing that I always think is we mentioned Mynock, so let's come back to that. But a couple obvious other sort of like platforms and places and channels and content and stuff to highlight. Obviously, Matt Wilkins it cannot be overstated how critical he was, and particularly on YouTube and then beyond, because his content started to be shared on these social media platforms like Facebook and here was someone who had already had a bunch of videos going back to 2012 from literally the night that
Hmm.
Disney bought Lucasfilm, right? Sort of like kind of chronicling things to almost immediately after decanonization, getting to YouTube, talking about what the EU was, started to get into things like what is continuity, what is canon, why does that matter? Started talking about quotes in defense of the EU and so on and so forth. And then by the end of 2014, I think it was around Christmas, said, I'm going to start celebrating the EU. And thus begins his reviews,
Hmm.
which we're now already on like the second sort of lap around the block, right? With his rereads, right? So it cannot be overstated how critically
Right.
important he is to both, I think, sharing positivity about what the EU was, providing information about it was, defending it, right? But also arguing that as a tactic. And this is something I've always thought mattered too. Almost as a tactic, it's like show newcomers how much fun it is to enjoy the EU, right? So that we kind of bring more people on board, right? You know what I mean? As a way of
Hmm.
fighting against a lot of the nonsense we had to fight about in the early days, both the infighting and the Civil War and the blue check marks on Twitter coming out against us and the Eric Gellers
Right.
and stuff, right? Critically important, Matt really was.
He's
And
he's why I'm here. Because again, when I found out about it, the first thing I did was I went online and it's like I looked for is there anyone that's doing anything to like there's anyone that cares about this as much as I do was basically what I
yeah,
was looking for. And I
yeah.
remember I was in like I was like 4 or 5 like threads 4 or 5 like pages into this argument on the threads and then someone puts this like watch this video he puts it great and it was a Matt Wilkins bit. It was just linked to one of his videos. It was the one where he was on vacation and he was sick and he's going through like some of the last
Yes,
remaining quotes I have,
yes,
and that was
yes.
the first ever Matt Wilkins video. And from there I found I found everything. It was
Hmm.
that was what led me to all of this and partially all of what's happened.
Yeah, right, right, right. I mean, I think me too, I mean, it's funny again, I have a pre-2014 history both in terms of like activism in defense of the idea of an EU as we started to sort of like kind of see some of the writing on the wall going back to like the earliest Clone Wars days. I mean, I was there protesting in 2008, um, given that sort of strange sense we had that something was up. But yeah, in terms of really like getting engaged, I think it was Matt too, and it's kind of like you. And I think don't you remember like you were one of like the first several score of his subscribers or something, don't you? I think you told me once you
Yes, I
remember sort of
was.
yeah.
I remember when he was at like double digit subscribers. I remember when he hit 100 subscribers. I think I had been subscribed to him for over a year at that point.
It's amazing. And he had been on YouTube like forever. I think he and I
Right.
both have like
He
accounts
has
from
a
like
viral video from like
2006.
2000, yeah, 6.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. All I can remember is that I think I was in I was somewhere in like the several hundreds. I can't
Mhm.
remember, you know what I mean? But he got to 1,000 pretty fast. I mean, it really
Yeah.
started to snowball, but Anyway, okay. Now there are a couple of other great things too, or like, platforms like that, Mynock's Nest, Jeremy Stupid Chainsaw Production Legends podcast, which you were on and just did another episode of
Hmm.
this week.
Which
One,
started
yeah, go ahead.
as like a continuation of Mynock's Nest, because Mynock's Nest was kind of ending a little bit. The crew of Mynock's Nest could no longer do it, and Jeremy was like, okay, well, there was also another podcast of how I met Jeremy was through an old friend of ours, uh, who had his own show and podcast that we would go on, and I met Jeremy through that, and he's like, hey, Mynock's Nest is kind of ending. We could do our own podcast, and that started what the Legends podcast would eventually become. But man, there's as much as I love Legends podcast, they don't hold a candle to old classic Mynock's Nest. It was some of the best, most fun stuff to listen to, and the couple times I could be a part of it, uh, I miss those guys.
Um, there, and I don't think all of those are still available, right? I mean, I think there's still some of them floating around, but I'm sure some have sort of like disappeared into the ether, right?
Yeah,
Potentially, I'm not sure. But it's fun. I mean, again, not to sound like all kind of like, oh, like if you weren't there, then boy, sorry for you, you missed out. But it was like, it was a fun time because, and it's so fun. And I told you recently, I went back and listened to most of the old Legends podcasts that you and Jeremy did. Just have them on the background, and those are so much fun too for a variety of reasons. They're a great time capsule. It's just so neat to
hmm
hear what fans were thinking at the time and stuff. But again, you guys clearly have fun too, and it's you're not just there talking about like, creating battle plans for how to continue stuff. You're talking about the EU, right? And it's
right.
so neat to see just that happening. It's
That
like locker talk. It's just like it's kind
hmm
of like almost like what you would have seen on the forums back in the day that they took away. It's just fun, right?
it's fun, and because again, for a lot of us, and I talked about this at the time, a lot of the people like who kind of gravitated to us, like within our own like circle of friends in our own like in our towns, we were like the Star Wars expert, right? We were like we would
Right.
be like, oh yeah, this, but we didn't have anyone else to talk to. And in the forums days, we had these forums, right? But there's only so much you can convey through a text chat. Being able
Hmm.
to like listen to a group of like 4 or 5 people have these deep, engaging conversations about like about these stories that like you had that you knew that you knew and that you could also engage with was just something that did not exist at the time, other than Mynock's Nest. And I think looking back on it, I think that's what kept drawing me back was these guys are great. They're entertaining. You can definitely tell that they're all friend. They're all really good friends, even though they had basically known each other for like a year at that point. But
Yeah.
just to be able to like live vicariously through having these conversations, because again, things like Discord didn't exist.
Yep.
Voice chatting outside of Skype, which was really not the greatest platform for it, although it did work, wasn't that big.
Right.
Otherwise, this was still in the area where long distance calling for some people was an incredibly expensive endeavor.
Yeah, exactly. Things have changed drastically, right? Just technologically, right? But it is, again, yeah, it's so great to have this. And again, it's so nice that some of the Mynock stuff are still available. Again, I think most of the Legends podcast stuff is too.
Yeah.
It's just fun to listen in on that too, and um I don't know. That's what I like about, the live streams that Matt does too to this day. They're fun to look back on, a year later or something, just to kind of like peek in on this, right? And again, just to see that people are having fun. And you also learn things too. Again, it's a chance to sort of, workshop theories about the EU and stuff. Again, this is what we want to talk about. And I think the important thing too is like never to get too caught up in the movement side of things, because ultimately what this movement's trying to do is to continue the content, right? So that the fandom can get back to enjoying Star Wars, not sort of
Hmm.
being constantly sort of worried about like having to convince the rogues to sort of come back, into the,
Right.
So anyway, but it's so much fun to see that stuff. Now, one thing I do want to make sure we highlight here is, was Tim involved in my next, or was he involved in the
Yes.
thing before? Okay. And
Tim
we
was
lost
involved with
Tim.
mine.
So
Yeah.
I just want to, rest in peace. Very, very sad, very important, very,
Hmm.
um,
In a lot of ways, because again, he was also
yeah,
one of the 10 founding members of the Alliance. He
yeah.
was very active in the early days in activism. He had actually been in activism well before the expanding universe movement came out.
Hmm.
within his own political sphere. So it was also just
Absolutely.
great having someone that was that involved in the community, who had like decades of experience in working with this, to kind of like he couldn't do everything, right, but to kind of like filter ideas and like on strategies through. Um,
Sure, sure. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think he even played I mean, just little things too. Like, I mean, I think he created a lot of like the great graphics and branding and
mhm,
stuff for those pages, right? That some people try to take credit for, a couple years
right.
later and stuff. But and interestingly too, for folks who don't know who we're talking about, this was a guy who early on, um, he was verified on Facebook. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
He was like a verified face. I don't even know anyone else who is, but I mean, he was just so omnipresent, just everywhere. You know what I mean? That I think he was even
Mhm,
recognized for just his like sheer contributions to comment sections and stuff like that. It was
right.
amazing. Very very sad.
And he kind of had a little bit of a reputation. He came off harsh in
Yeah,
text
yeah,
chat, but if you actually would talk with him, he was a gentle giant, kind of.
for sure, for sure. Yeah. So we just wanted to make sure, rest in peace to him. Very
Yeah.
important part, not forgotten, never forgotten. Um, so one quick thing I want to go to before we leave 2014, and we might have to make this a two-part stream. I don't
We
know. I mean, I
might.
can go for a while, but we'll see. We'll see. But just something I just think is worth pointing out as an example. I should have worked it in earlier. I don't want it to seem sort of out of place here, but when we talk about those social media platforms and groups and stuff that kind of overnight sort of were EU here, and then the next day are like just like turned against us, right?
Mhm,
As if they'd forgot. To me, one of the most important ones in this regard is the Star Wars Hub. Now, this is something that is a big, big Facebook group to this day. I mean, hundreds of thousands of followers, right? Is connected to all sorts of things. Really, and particularly back during like the early period here, right? Really
mhm.
exerted a lot of sort of, you might say, cultural sort of like influence, had a lot of weight to throw around, right? And I think was in the position in a couple of cases potentially to sort of make some of those calls to some of the Lucasfilms. I'm not actually arguing this, but I mean, would have had the power to sort of say, you don't want those guys at Celebration, that type of a thing, right? This is someone who Star Wars Hub pre 2014 was a Facebook group called Petition for Battlefront 3, right? This was the entire
Yeah.
movement of hundreds of thousands of people that he was able to hold on to amazingly, right? To sort of turn into a force against the EU. It all signed up under the pretense of
And was
actually
a
supporting the
huge
EU
thorn in
project.
huge thorn in our side, but
Humongous.
would come up constantly and try to undermine or like
Yeah.
add on to the oh, don't listen to these guys, would pile to the fire of like, look at all these people who are doing all these bad things, who claim to be from you guys, who in a lot of cases weren't. Just
It
yeah.
That's one of those things where it's really funny every once in a while. I reflect on the fact that like, wow, that whole thing, it really does seem to have like disappeared, and thank goodness. But I mean, there was a period of time where I feel like it really felt like every day you were having to watch your back. There was some new sort of
Mhm.
attempt, right? And it's again, we're being a little cryptic because I'm not calling names out. I mean, I've effectively done so by referring to the group, but and I'll just say this, and I'll just be a little cryptic about this. People know that I'm not the biggest fan of like petitions as a strategy for social change, and one reason is that the person behind this
Yes,
group would,
yes, yes,
right?
yes,
Well, should we get into this really quickly? I don't know. Like,
yes. Again, I think enough time has passed. They're still around, they're still active, but I think enough
right?
time has passed that it's safe to talk about these things.
Yeah, yeah. We won't name names, right? Again, you can do your own homework, right? But no, I mean, one of the things that I mean, used to reach out. They used to reach out to me as I discovered. They used to reach out to tons of people, right, and sort of say, "Hey, look, like they claimed that they had all this marketing background and stuff, and they'd say, "Hey, I've got an idea for how you can get the EU continued again. Just create this petition, right?" So they really wanted to sort of convince people to do this. I think ultimately with the aim of ensuring that these petitions didn't get a lot of signatures, and then
Then they
would
could be
provide.
like, haha, look at this.
Yeah,
Because
exactly, right.
again, a lot of people, I have a Word document on my computer that is a list of a link to every single Save the EU petition that has ever been attempted that I have found. And anytime someone comes to me and says we should start a petition, I just send them the text file of all the links to the
Yeah,
petitions we've tried. And it's
the
like
graveyard of yeah.
we've done this, it doesn't work. It's
Yeah.
not
It doesn't. And by the way, and just for folks who are wondering, again, it's like I said before, not trying to contradict myself, let 1,000 flowers bloom. If you want to start one, knock your socks off, right? I'm probably not going to sign up, but if you do, if your buddies do it, great, right? But I don't think it's going to work, and it has nothing to do with the EU or with your prowess. I just don't think they work anyway. But
Mhm.
this dude would come along and try and convince us that this was the only way forward, and how he was going to do everything he could to help or whatever, right? Meanwhile, I used to tell him, if you want to help us, how about you just stop harming us, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
just go back to neutral, and maybe we'll all be in a better position, right?
Meanwhile, at the same time, we had a letter writing. At that time, we had a letter writing campaign, and despite the fact that there was only I think there was only actually 10 or 15 people actually actively sending letters, we at some point we got a response from Disney and we got a response from Del Rey to those letters, and several times actually we would send them. We'd send them. I actually remember originally the letter writing before I came about that they were be sent out on the last day of the month. And then by the third month that happened, the last day of the month was a Sunday, which letters don't go out on Sunday. So we said, okay, the last Friday of the month. And then I took over for like a year and a half, and it was the last Friday. And it was always the same people who I saw that were like, yep, sent letters. And coincidentally, they all ended up working at being a part of Twin Sons. Funny that.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Well, no, there's a lot. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Again, it's like the kind of the continuity of the doers, right? Kind of keep
mhm.
finding them, and kind of, attract other sort of doers, right? Who end up kind of keep the ball rolling in lots of interesting ways. But yeah. So, well, okay. I think we've said enough on that score, but
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Wow. What should we do? We've gone an hour and 15. It feels like we've gone longer at it, not in a bad way. It's just there's so much ground we're covering.
There's
So
so much.
we just technically left 2014 now. So
Yes.
should we do see if we can get through 2015 or what?
Yeah,
I mean, what? Yeah.
let's try to get through 2015 because a
Okay.
lot happened in 2014 was a lot of groundwork and a lot of
Yeah.
by 2015 I think the movement had roughly gotten its act together and we were actively doing things. It just that there was a lot of opposition to what we were 2014 was let's figure this out.
Yeah.
2015 is let's go do this.
I totally agree, and I think the one other thing to say is that I remember in the late fall of 2014 walking away from a lot of like those social media discussions and stuff on those groups and things, just feeling like, ugh, like there is so much understandable, but just like rage and hatred or whatever. Like, when are we going to do something with this, right? I feel like the beginning of 2015 is when things change, where it was kind of like,
Mhm.
it's like that last half of 2014, everyone, it's like they needed to get that psychic mess out of their system, right? But by
Right.
2015, I think we were ready to roll, so
It was a lot of I'm just trying to grab a prop for later. There was a lot of anger, basically. A lot of
totally. Yeah.
this rage that we had, and we didn't know how to effectively channel it in 2014. And that's
Mhm.
what led to a lot of the rebel raids and the sort of bad reputation those got, again, partially due to the fact that Eric Geller used a lot of our comments on those raids out of context to make us look
Mhm.
bad, but also because we didn't know else to do but go on social media on whenever they released a new book and say, hey, we want legends.
Yeah. Right. 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 Um, okay. So 2015. So I'll go through the list here of things that we jotted down. And again, like, this is not comprehensive, right? But
Mhm.
obviously, Aftermath and Chuck Wendig, right? And those several different sort of subtopics within that.
Right.
Obviously, The Force Awakens and all of the lead up, right? Then there's the spoiler jihad, which we're going to have to explain, which could be its own video, has
Right.
been its own video. But I think in general, some positive things. Just in general, the fandom is growing. The movement is, as you said, is sort of like solidifying around sort of a couple of core objectives. Celebration Anaheim, which you were at, right?
Yes. So
Yeah,
again, a little time capsule because I don't think a lot of people know this. So at Celebration Anaheim, the movement went. There was, I think, about a half a dozen of us that had gone to to Anaheim because we were just like, okay, we're gonna go to Celebration. We're gonna talk to people and actually explain what we're trying to do, and we're going to try to recruit. I remember we had business cards we had made that would link to YouTube video that had links to YouTube videos and or like Matt Wilkins channels and the
yeah.
various groups that we were on. And it was going to be this huge thing. And I remember a lot of people don't know this, the way we identify ourselves, this sounds so weird to say right now, but I still have it. We wore these armbands with like an orange stripe down them. And that was how like we could identify who we were. So that
No
we when we
kidding.
could all get up.
I don't
Yeah.
remember that. Wow.
And I still have it. It's a little
Wow.
orange piece of duct tape on an armband.
Look at that. Isn't that amazing?
And I thought to myself as we were doing this, like I don't think anyone other than like the 6 or 7 of us that actually went know this. That's
Yeah.
what we did.
Everyone's looking at it being like, what costume is that? Like what comic is that from that someone just wears that arm? Oh, that's hilarious. Yeah. Wow. But you had some interesting encounters, right? I mean, you ran into Leland Chi there, didn't you?
Yeah, I ran into Leland Chi. Funny story about Leland Chi. The first time I ran into Leland Chi, there was like a celebration stage, and it was Leland Chi and Pablo Hidalgo. And I'm just sitting there waiting to talk to them. And there's another guy next to me that's also sitting there. And like 3 or 4 people come up to him, and like it's like, hey, can I? And I get your, and I look over. It's like, and I say, hey, are you this? And like, no, 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 I'm not. Oh, well, are you this? No, no, no. Who are you? And he says, oh, I'm Steve Sansweet.
Oh,
And I'm just
nice.
like, I've been standing next to Steve Sansweet for 15 minutes. And I didn't even know. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm just like trying to make
Yeah.
up for like, um, moral of the story. If you're going to go to convention and you're talking about, and you want to, especially about things like books where like, you don't know what people look ahead of time of what people look like so you can actually recognize them.
It's a good rule of thumb. Yeah, yeah. I've had that experience too at conferences, man. It's really embarrassing. Yeah. Good advice. Good advice.
But yeah, I talked to Leland Chi. He seemed I've said this on the Legends podcast. At the time, he was genuinely excited that there was a new movie coming out. And
Right.
he seemed really shy and awkward and not like someone who wanted to step on too many toes or like make a big fuss out of something. And I think that that in a lot of ways I think explains how he went from such a avid defender of the EU pre 2014 to what he is now. But I also had a lot of Glover conversations. I talked with Christy Golding. This is where we got the. This is, admittedly, it's through mine, but this is where we got the sort of the I never wrote it, sort of the Jedi thing was because I asked
Uh,
her about it, and she
yeah.
was like, yeah. But I talked to Lucino. I talked to Karpashin. Um,
Yeah.
who else was there? Alan Dean Foster was there. We had a
Mhm.
funny story on the Legends podcast
Yes.
about that. But I asked them all. It's like, hey, would you write? Would you write for Legends again? They brought it back, and they all said, yeah, sure. I remember Karpashin was even like had his own ideas about
Oh
like,
yeah.
oh yeah, I wanted to do this and this and this. If they, I'd love to write it if they'd have me, but if they'd have me, because a lot of how the publishing, at least with Lucasfilm, was is that they would come to you and say, "Hey, we need you to write this story," and then they would write that story
Mhm.
of how it worked. But I also got to talk to, and again, I didn't know at the time how lucky I was to talk to this person, but I got to meet and have a few conversations with Shelly Shapiro. And man, if I had a
Oh
time
wow.
machine, I would go back in time and talk to her about so many things. Because
Yeah.
I did, again, at the time, I'm just like, oh yeah, you're one of the editors. But then afterwards, and I'm like, no, you weren't just any editor. You were like the editor that was coordinating New Jedi Order. How did I not like,
Yeah.
how did,
No, I know, right? I know. Those are another things. Yeah, again, the same way that like I want like some business journalists to write the sort of like what's the business story about what happened 2012 to 2014 and what happened ultimately to our storyline. I want there needs to be a massive 9 million hour long oral history with some of these folks, right? You know what I mean? Before it's too late. And in some cases it already is. But wow, yeah, fascinating. Um, well, celebration's interesting, by the way. It's just worth bookmarking because we'll obviously talk about other celebrations when we get into other years and just sort of like how sort of the mood change and wax and wane, right? You know what I mean? Um, speaking of cons, there's the Dragoncon controversy from 2014 or 2015, which you guys also talked about in the most recent Legends podcast, I think, again.
mhm.
And I think that's only worth mentioning, not because there's anything new to say about it. It's just that, like, if you were to Google, hit pieces about the EU movement, you're going to find some things about this, right? You know what I mean? And it just,
Mhm.
I think it's probably fair to say that, like, one of the rogues did some just really sort of like socially sort of inappropriate behavior at Dragoncon, a little too aggressive about promoting uh, the EU and the EU fandom movement and stuff like that. And it just unfortunately I think
Led
it
to a
made a
bunch
bigger
of issues.
splash.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But it's one of those things for a long time, really, I think dominated. It was the sort of thing that I think like, it was the type of thing that got enough press that like some of the bigger influencers on the anti-EU side they would come back to it from time to time. It was the measure they used to judge all of us, right? So, okay, well, a couple of big things, obviously, the Revan fan poll, right?
Yeah,
So we're starting to see,
this was this is the one that I don't think the EU movement had. No offense to us, I honestly don't think we had that much of an impact on this one.
That's probably fair, right?
Because when the Revan fan poll happened, Revan was the only EU character, so there was no like split vote like we had in a lot of other years where we were competing against everyone else. It was just kind of a, hey, there's only one EU guy, let's vote for him, and then we all did. But then Revan won by such a huge landslide that like I can honestly in good faith say, yeah, that was only us. There was probably a lot of people who wanted Revan to be a figure. It was a very popular figure. Kind of like a lot of different communities came together to make that happen. But it was still a very early victory that was like, you have this one Legends character against a character from the new canon in Sabine, which they made a runner-up figure anyway.
Yeah, of
and
course.
there's some conspiracy theories as to why that happened, and that maybe sort of they wanted to make that figure, but then it lost so bad, and they'd already made that figure, so that they just gave it to the Revan figure and said, "Oh, we'll do the bonus figure anyway." And then the other 4 figures that didn't win also ended up having their own figures made anyway, which again kind of proved our point that they're not going to make the EU figures if we don't tell them to make them. In fact, that would actually happen in the next 2 fan polls after that, where all of the non-EU figures would eventually have figures made of them, whereas the EU ones that lost didn't.
Exactly. And there's going to be a lot to say about Ben Skywalker and everything else, in future years when it comes to those sorts of things. But I think the other really big thing that obviously directly relates to you in 2015 is really the Twin Suns Foundation.
Yeah, I actually don't know if it started in 2015 yet.
Well, it's certainly true that the group of people who are responsible for putting it together, I think, were getting the billboard ramped up around then, right? And so it's sort of, they kind of, to me, in my mind, always kind of blends together, right? So
yeah, it's it's like a I guess to put this into like historical precedent, the Continental Congress had formed, but the United States had yet to secede.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. This is the first Continental Congress, right? We're not in the second one yet. We're not. Yeah, it's 1775 still, right? So no, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And obviously a lot more to be said about that. But I mean, I'll just say on a personal note, I had been in and out of those social media groups from the beginning. Again, I've been involved with some pre-2014 that were sort of agitating for a defense of the EU from what we were worried about what would become of it. Found Matt like you early on, all that kind of stuff. But it was the conservative movement around ramping up for the billboard, and then for the things that became Twin Suns that really got me like ultimately longer like connected with you and Brian and other people like that. So that was really important for me. Again, I wouldn't be here probably talking to you on this stream right now. Might not even have this channel if it wasn't for that, because I was sort of like kind of a behind the scenes kind of person, just kind of like trying to make my impact, trying to sort of make arguments, trying to be involved in some ways. But that was an interesting sort of like you sort of, there was an interesting sense. It really felt like things really were moving. We were going to see a tangible product in the form of this billboard if we could get it funded, which I thought we would, and you guys did, and then got put up. And then it felt like, it was inspirational, right? Because it was really this fandom and this movement and this fandom really doing something. And that was at that point that I thought, yeah, again, I want to do something too, and it was really, it was an important moment.
Yeah, I think I will talk about that because that was 2015. We've talked about this so many times, but it was in the middle of the summer, like July or August, that at the end of recording, I think it was a Mynock's Nest, or it might have been something else. But it was like one of the Matt Skype calls when Matt, I think it was myself, Matt, Tristan from Mynock's Nest, and Jeremy, and they said, "Hey, I've got this idea. Surge did this thing. The Crystal Pepsi did this thing where they put a billboard. They do all the stuff we did, and they put a billboard." And it's like, yeah, that's a good idea. And then I said at the time, this would be really great if we could do it after the new movie to come out. So we should wait till then. And it kind of got tabled for a very long time until we've already mentioned him, so I'll mention him again. John Sadler on one of the pages that he was running had, I think, because he didn't really talk to Matt all that much. He was aware of Matt; they had talked a few times, but I don't think he was in contact. But he had the same idea, and actually made like a fake graphic for what it would look like, and he posted that publicly. And then I said to him, "Yeah, we had this idea for it, but we were going to wait till the new movie came out." And then I think Brian also saw that thread and was like, well, we should start working on it now. So we took it over to this Facebook group that was what was called the Page Owners Alliance, basically a bunch of people who had groups and or Facebook pages with big reach, and there were, it sounds weird to say, but like loyal, I guess, EU loyalist, I guess, or like wanted to see the continuation all congregated.
And wanted to work together, right.
And then we posted this idea, and it became a thread. And then the thread was like all, as I said on that stream, it was all theoretical up until Brian picked up the phone and called Clear Channel, got us a quote, got us locations, got us all that portfolio, and then it was go time. We had our team of 6, and that were like really into it, and it was a solid month of groundwork before the Indiegogo even went up. It was a solid like month of getting all the ducks in a row, of making sure we had everything, because we were nobodies back then. I was a nobody. Brian was a nobody. I knew who Brian was because, again, he was one of the people who would always be on the who was always like sending pictures of like, oh look, I sent my letter in on the letter writing campaign. So I know who Brian was. I know who Bill was. I know who I had known who Gordon was, but like the greater fandom didn't really know who we were outside of Matt. So there was a lot of stuff that we had to talk about. It's like, okay, how do we make this? Because our biggest concern was people are going to think this is a cash grab and that we're going to take the money and run. You know, this was the year after what was it called? The Tumblr convention happened. And I don't think anyone else that was on anyone else's mind, but it was fresh in my mind because I spent a part of time in the Chicago area where that happened, and I knew some people who were at that con.
So, wow! I had no idea.
And so how do we make this legit? How do we make this like as transparent as possible? And then it goes up. We get a bunch of donations in like the first week, and then we get 2 weeks of like a week or two of like nothing. Where like it's kind of trickling in, and we're at like less than 30% of our goal. And I remember on the Indiegogo page, we had set it up to where, okay, we were only going to do it at 1 month. And if we don't hit the goal at the month, it all gets refunded to you, because that was, again, our transparency of like, look, we're not here to make a quick buck and cash out. We want to do this, and we're going to do this. And I remember at the time we had the backup plan of, well, if we can get close, we can extend it to 2 months. But we found out that we can't do that once we make the fundraiser public. We can't extend it. We have to either set it from 1 month or 2 months from the onset. So now we have this hard deadline. And there was this debate internally about what to do if we didn't fund. And I don't want to say who was on what side of the debate, but it was basically some of us were of the opinion of, well, if the fandom can't put this together, then we will. We'll just put like a couple $100 of it every paycheck, and we'll save up until we get enough, and we'll do the billboard. And there were other people who said, if it doesn't fund, then clearly no one but us wants this, and it's time to give this up. And that was around the time Matt started pushing it out more on his channel and adding the stream goals. That was when Brian did the match challenge and ended up, I think a quarter of the billboard was funded by Brian alone from just doing the match challenge. And then we got super close, and then we finally hit it. And then there was a bit of drama because after we had hit the goal, and we'd cleared the goal. And then one of our biggest donors, who was underage, on the age of 18, and was probably donating through his parents' credit card. I guess either him or his parents like found out about them, called the credit card company, and like they pulled the money. And then we all of a sudden went from like 105% of the goal to like 102%. And now we were worried because again, we had that thing of if we don't hit the goal, it all
Right.
gets refunded. And we
Right.
had thought that, oh no, if there was some like troll who had donated a whole bunch of money and was going to charge it back at the last second, and then we'd lose all that progress. That was a huge concern for us for that last week. Even when we'd already hit the goal, we were just. And I remember even Brian had like an emergency fund of like, okay, if that like of like $300 or $400 just to like put in at the last second just in case that happened. It ended up not happening, and we and that was
so dramatic.
I know. I don't think a lot of people know that, but that was
Right.
a conversation that was going, and that was it. Because once that happened, and like we were just like, oh shoot, could it happen? If it happens again, we might lose this, and we might have to start all over.
And imagine even if it would. Yeah, I know, right? And no, and it works so great. And I mean, yeah, gosh, I mean, you think about it. Even if there was just another couple technicalities like that, like someone put the wrong card number in, it gets taken back. You're right. Just like the way that the crowdfunding platform worked. Imagine having to explain to the movement, no, it worked. It's just there's this technicality, and I know you guys got refunded, but can you give it back one more time? I mean, it would be impossible to explain. Holy cow! Wow.
And we had fundraised in December, which is like we found out later was the worst time of year to fundraise.
Yes. Right. Right. Well, it's fun. I donated. I'll give away my donor privacy to admit that, and I'm trying to remember how I would have found out. I maybe found out about it through Matt. Because I remember some of those stretch goals. In fact, I remember the reason I remember that is I remember one of the cool perks was you were going to get like a 20-minute video where he went through a tour of his book collection. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And so I remember at some point in January or something getting that, like a private link. And I was just like, this is great, so. And I remember one of them too. I think one of the perks might have been he also did, I think it's now public, but didn't he do like an extra commentary on the Clone Wars or something? That might have been another perk too, but
yeah, a bunch of privated videos that like that went out to everyone who donated to those basically. And I think they're mostly out. Oh, there was another one that we can't talk about, unfortunately, but it was great.
Is it Wendig or was that something else?
Yeah, it was I'll just say there are more Wendig's worlds.
Yes. If you don't know, sorry, you don't know, but if you know, it's hilarious, right? Yeah. But I remember, and we can probably end, and I will make this a part 1 video, and we can come back and do, many other years when we get another chance, right? Let people sort of digest this, right? But just to look ahead in 2016 really briefly, I remember you guys then going and actually seeing it, right? And I remember the photos on social media of you guys outside Lucasfilm with the Yoda statue, right? And stuff. And honestly, it's funny. I remember, I don't think you and I don't think we knew of each other yet.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of knew who you were just by virtue of the work you were doing there. We didn't ultimately meet until 2017 in person at Celebration, but in any event, I remember seeing that, and I was so thrilled for you guys that you got to do that. And I kind of actually at the time remember thinking, oh man, I wish you guys had also somehow like organized all of us to do that too. I would have totally gone, you know what I mean? Just to see that there.
We should have. But it was so surreal, just like standing out in front of it and walking because it was like on the side of a hotel, and like walking down the street and just standing there and just being like, we did that. Like that's there because of us.
Yeah. And Pablo saw it and tweeted it, right? And everything.
Yeah.
And really, really cool. Well, is there anything else about 2015 then before we end up part 1 here?
On a good note, I think we do have to talk about this spoiler jihad, because I don't think a lot of people know about what that is.
Yeah, you're right. And I think I will say, because there's only so much we can say about it now. risk not being comprehensive. But there are some good write-ups about it on the expandinguniverse.com. If you search for this, Brian Borg, I think, laid out a really good history of this. Both provides the context as well as sort of, I think, our side of things, right? So do you want to give like a brief overview about what that was
Yeah,
all
so
about?
basically what happened, again, the Alliance, which in the early days, most of what happened was through the Alliance.
And by the way, in case we weren't super clear before, there was a Facebook group called and Facebook page called the Alliance to Preserve
The
the
Expanding
Expanding
Universe.
Universe. Yeah. So just for in case folks don't remember that, right? Yeah.
That was there were many groups made, but that was the largest and the most active in
Yeah.
in the within regards to the movement.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it
It was seen. It
basically,
was really seen as the place where the
yeah.
movement was really, yeah, right.
So on this topic, this post got made, and in the comments of this post, like I think 3 or 4 users um had this. I said like we don't even know if it was jokingly or not, but they said
Right.
had this idea of, hey, we should go around and spoil the Force Awakens and to all these other places. And like, yeah, that's good. We can go here and here and here, and like a bunch of people talking about it. This happens like really late at night when most of the mods were like not awake, and it was something that was against the group rules because talking about, again, in order to like kind of not necessarily gatekeep, but like keep the content on track. Talking about the new stuff was against the rules, and we were still
Right.
under the impression of no hate watching. Don't
Absolutely.
watch it, right? But it didn't get seen until the next morning when Tim went on there and said, "Guys, don't do that," and then eventually ended up banning them all. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, someone took screenshots of what them saying this, sent it to, I think it was the Bleeding Cool was the first place that it came out, and eventually it got sprayed on on Yahoo News, that on Yahoo's actual website, that
Yeah.
EU fans were going to go out and spoil the plot of The Last Jedi on forums and all over the internet to ruin people's enjoyment, and that
Yeah.
was the story, and that
Right.
was such a of all of the hit pieces, that's probably the one that we've had to that's the one that we've had to fight the most of our
Totally.
reputation.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah. Totally agree. Because everyone's primed to think that's what every one of us wanted to do in the first place, right? And it just, and again, yeah, it was an interesting moment too, because you realized how many people there were in those groups that were probably there just lurking, waiting
Hmm.
for things like that to pass on to other folks and stuff like that. But it's funny too, based on what I remember of it. Like some of the people who I remember seeing in some of the screen captures, sort of talking about this, were people who, based on my other experiences with them in those groups, were clearly not people
Hmm.
like with some sinister aim. They were people who were always the people who would make these kind of silly sorts of things inside the safety of this group, right? You know what I mean? The
Hmm.
type of people who you remember back in the day, they wouldn't call it new canon, they would call it like the rat verse because of Mickey
Hmm.
Mouse. The people who just said
Right.
silly things all the time just because that's what social media makes you do. But um that's when, going back to like the Star Wars hub too, and people behind that, they took that and ran with that for as far as they could go. And yeah, it's for all the good things, there was always sort of like one step forward, several steps back, right? Constantly a sense of having to dig out of this hole that everyone was ready to sort of like pounce, right? Everyone, the EU movement, the EU fandom was guilty from the day it was decanonized, right? You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
every time someone, accidentally farted in the room, there was a hit piece ready to go, right? Like,
Right.
you guys, so
But
uh,
because of it got put on Yahoo basically, and it got everywhere. And I
total
remember
legitimacy,
even
right? Yeah.
Brian, because this was around the time that we were planning the billboard, that this happened, and because it was
Yeah.
right around the time of it release, which the new Disney movies all came out in December for some reason. Um,
Right.
and Brian had to contact Yahoo and say, "Hey, you're taking these people's like actual names out of and like putting them on the article. Like you can't do that. There's you." And they eventually had to make a redacted version of it with their names out of it. And that was like the only sort of victory we got out of that whole thing, was at least
Right.
getting people's names out of there.
Right. Exactly. Well, gosh, yes, because, and this is, I think, I can't remember if we mentioned this or not. And this is something I probably wouldn't want to end this without saying something about too, but you remind me something really, really, really critically important about the early EU movement, right? When you talked very early on in the stream about how people just, if you weren't around, you just don't know how difficult it was, like say pre Last Jedi, to be an EU fan before it was cool to sort of, diss on everything in pop culture for reasons like this, right? Because Yahoo, like some major sort of like platform is legitimizing sort of like all like the intuitions people have about how awful they think we are. The threats that came at us personally, right? You know what I mean? Not just as a fandom, not just as a strategy, not just as an idea that the EU should continue, right? But as fans, both collectively and individually, right? Putting people's names out there was legitimately putting them in harm's way, right? From all of like the weirdo haters out there, right? Who after April 25th, 2014, were in some cases out for literal blood, right? And then the thing that I really want to highlight, if you, to this day, if you go on a lot of these old EU groups and Facebook pages and things like that, what you'll often notice is that a lot of the admins and mods, they have like made up names, right? So it's like no one signs their name. If there's like a, say, a collectively owned Facebook group, no one signs their name like Joe Blow. They go like, oh, I'm Cade, right? Oh, I'm Mara, Why did they do that? Why do a lot of people who are of a certain era in the EU movement have made up names online? It's because of the personal threats, and that can't. I hope that's never forgotten. There's a reason why people have cute names. Now it's just sort of it's just a tradition in social media. You come up with a fake name, a fake avatar, right? Like that. Back then, you had to have a made up name because people were legitimately coming after other people just for liking this stuff. It was serious, very serious. Yeah. So I remind people that from time to time, it's one of those things like I don't think they believe me, but again, hopefully the death threats have stopped, right? You know what I mean? But back then it was pretty serious, So yeah. Okay, so wow. Okay, we just covered 2 years in 2 hours, so a lot of years to go, right? So, but we'll come back. I think this was good. Hopefully this was fun. I just wanted to kind of make a record, right? We've covered a lot, and there's some. So hopefully it's a nice.
We probably forgot about a bunch of things. We're going to see it in the comments, and we'll have to address it in the next one.
Totally right. Well, it's interesting, I even in this list that we've got offline, where there's tons of things that I know we're not including here that like there's several different ways of creating a list like this. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the movement and the fandom, but when it comes to like just the EU in general, it's like there's tons of things that like, comic omnibuses start getting reprinted, right? And things like that. So there's like all these actual things happening in the publishing side too, and things like that, right?
The last EU books, like when the Imperial Handbook came out, which was I think the last pre-decanonization new bit of EU material that got out there. Even like we were okay. You don't understand how starved we were for EU content. We were actively promoting the paperback release of Honor Among Thieves. That's how low it was back. That's how little we had to go off of at the time.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it truly starved. And that's why, as I say, I mean, it's funny. I look back now. Of course, I still have them because I'm like a pat rack, and what am I trying to say? A rat pack, right? And I keep everything, but like, I'll never get rid of anything Star Wars. But it's like I still have my, my Thrawn reissues with the new covers. Which again, I look back now and I go, why did I buy them? I think the covers are a huge downgrade from the previous one. But I'm like, but we were so starved. I was just crazy desperate to sort of get out there and get more new EU stuff, right? So even in the form of repackaged stuff, but what a time, man. Wow. And it's I can't believe how many years have not passed since all that's been gone down.
We're 2 years away from the 10-year.
That's going to be a biggie, particularly because, and we said this before, right? It's like we all knew we needed to wait at least until 2019, right? Now it's like, okay, well, that's a couple of years ago. So like, what are we waiting for now? But the 10th anniversary is going to be a really big one. And it's maybe time to start thinking about a big way of commemorating that, So,
yeah.
But what I hope we're doing here is, particularly for folks who are like maybe newer to the movement or newer to the fandom or just newer to Star Wars who are getting into the EU. I just, if they from time to time hear bits and pieces about this old history, want to provide sort of a record for it. But what I hope more than anything, we've sort of shown that there are lots of good things that have happened these last 2 years we've been talking about. There's lots of good things to come to, right? And hopefully over the next several years. And decade or whatever to come, there'll be more and more good things too. So hopefully it's been a record of more good things than bad things, right? But it's been a battle. Yeah.
Pre-2014 to 2015 is where most of our events are. It actually gets a little bit more slim pickings as we get on to the years.
It really does. And that's really interesting. And it's funny. Yeah. Again, jumping ahead, it's like 2016, 2017. I mean, there's like big things in 2017, right? You know, obviously like Celebration, things, but, and there's lots of other little things that happen in between there. Like notice in 2018, I couldn't even think of anything.
Yeah,
it's
I couldn't either.
Down periods, right? Yeah. I mean, I suppose someone might say, you know, like the rise of like the fandom menace and things like that, and the EU's relationship, you know, relative to that and things like that. But what's I think so interesting is this many years past it, and in particular, what do we always say? Get past 2019, and I think interestingly, look at 2021 on our sheet. Things really explode again, right? And I think that's really interesting. Just goes to show, if you wait around long enough, something amazing like Heart of the Jedi blowing up on Amazon happens, right? You know, in addition to all the other cool things that we got just last year. But we'll talk about all of that, I guess, in future streams. So I guess, yeah. Any final thoughts about 2014 and 2015 before we say goodbye for a while?
It's weird. I'm weirdly nostalgic for those days. As bad as it was, it's like there was just something about it, and not to. I kind of miss the people who were active. A lot of people that have either left for different reasons or had different falling outs. It's like I do miss a lot of them, you know, and I want to know how they're doing, and I want to kind of. It's a lot of like we've done so much, but it's also like there's something almost like romantic about that like era of when we were actually envisioning ourselves as the actual like rebel alliance, like fighting against the evil empire Disney.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you might have just hit on why some of those old like Legends podcasts and Mynocks are fun to still go back and listen to. It really bottles that sense, I think, in a really wonderful way, right? And again, it's not all about, to be clear, it's not all about bashing Disney. It's all about the Rebel Alliance forming to sort of just try and work with Disney to sort of put things right. You know what I mean? So, but it is a romantic time, and it's funny. I've wanted to do this as much just to sort of try and recapture that nostalgia too, right? I hope this is helpful for people watching this and for posterity. I just wanted to talk about this with someone who was there, right? Because it's just a fun time, you know, and it's amazing now. I look back at how many years now have passed since then. There's so much to look back on. Maybe in 10 years, we'll look back on this period as like one of those other resurgent times. And it's funny, 2021 to me was a pretty special year too, particularly the first half of it, and the Heart of the Jedi stuff alone. That was something too. It felt like finally things were kind of like bearing fruit in some ways or something, right? You know, it felt like we could take a little EU victory lap, but those early days really, and that's the thing too. We sometimes use these things interchangeably, but there was always a Star Wars fandom and there was an EU fandom within that. But those early days that we've described, that's when a movement inside the EU fandom really emerged, right? And so I think it was fun to, in my own case, sort of be on the periphery for a while. But again, great to hear your sort of insider takes on all of that too. So anyway, this is part one. We will be back for probably another 17 parts to sort of finally wrap up this whole story. So with that, I think we will say goodnight, and we will see everyone next time. Bye-bye.